Hello and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler and I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. In this event, Dr. Sarah Ray will discuss climate change and how emotions play a role in our response to this problem. But before we introduce Dr. Ray, I'll say a few words about our speaker series and how you can participate. So Ethically Speaking, as you can see, is organized by the UCF Center for Ethics with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, Associate Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture and founding director of the Center for Ethics. And we developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time. We encourage you to visit the center's website at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. We'd also like to hear your feedback and your ideas for future talks in Ethically Speaking. Ethics connects to every facet of our professional and personal lives. The importance of ethics at UCF is clear from the long list of partners who co-sponsor this series. All of us in this partnership hope you enjoy the discussions in Ethically Speaking, and we hope it cultivates understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. So today's presentation is being recorded, and we will post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and share it with others. At the end of the presentation, Dr. Ray will take questions moderated by Dr. Beaver. Submit your questions during the talk directly to Dr. Beaver via chat. And if we have time for your question, he will invite you to unmute and pose your question directly. Now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Beaver to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Dr. Kubler, and thanks to everybody for being here with us today. It's very much my pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray. Dr. Ray comes from a richly interdisciplinary humanities and environmental sciences background. She holds a BA in Religious Studies from Swarthmore, an MA in American Studies from UT Austin, and a PhD in Environmental Sciences Studies and Policy from the University of Oregon. That background has supported numerous and impactful projects, including her 2013 book, The Ecological Other, her 2017 volume, Critical Norths, Space, Nature, Theory, and her 2019 work, Latinx Environmentalism's Place, Justice, in the Decolonial. Dr. Ray's most recent book, A Field Guide to Climate Change, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet, draws attention to the existential crises felt by many young people who are inheriting a changed and maybe threatened world. I have to imagine that these impressive works are inspired in part by her own environment. Since 2013, Dr. Ray has been program leader of the Environmental Studies program at Poly Humboldt, until just recently Humboldt State University, located in a wonderfully beautiful part of the country between the redwoods and the ocean. I was introduced to Dr. Ray several years ago now, just as she joined the faculty there at Humboldt, Cal Poly. I was inspired by her passion and sophistication in thinking with others about what often feel to me to be dark and somewhat painful questions about our human impacts in and on the natural world. But dark and painful are not Dr. Ray's approach. She continues to inspire me and others by helping reimagine new possibilities for positive lived experiences in a changing world. We're grateful for her willingness to join us for Ethically Speaking this afternoon. So please give your warmest Zoom clappy hands and warm welcome to Dr. Sarah Ray.
Thanks so much, Dr. Beaver and Dr. Kubler, very much to UCF for hosting me and having me here today. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to see everybody in the chat and in the participants list and some of your faces. So it's nice to be here with you virtually. I'm calling into you from Wiyot territory, the native land on which Arcata, California, which is known on the maps as Arcata, sits, and the Wiyot have been here for time immemorial, making this landscape absolutely beautiful. And exactly like Dr. Beaver said, an amazing place to be. And before here, I was in Tlingit territory, which is also known as Juneau, Alaska, which also inspired a lot of this work. I managed to live in some pretty amazing places that Indigenous peoples have been sustainably cultivating for millennia, for time immemorial. So I want to honor that and state that in my work, the commitment that that makes me have is that in my work, as I hope you'll see, the beginning of my entree into environmental studies actually came from a justice and a humanities background, which is not very common for environmental studies. Most people get into environmental work or environmental sciences through more of a science background or from being in the outdoors and trying to maybe escape people. So I find that I come to environmental studies because I thought that this would be a wonderful way to access and find different ways to understand social justice questions. And so one of those big questions, of course, is indigenous, traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous sovereignty, land back movement. And we have a really active set of conversations happening on our campus around that I'm really grateful to be part of. So just a little bit of background before I share some slides. I have this book talk. I just published this book in 2020, right in the middle, about a week after George Floyd was murdered, and about 2 weeks after, so somewhere in the throes, I can't even remember all the sequence of events of COVID having just canceled classes and this sort of new normal being upon us of total uncertainty and turbulence. And I remember having a conversation with my senior capstone environmental studies undergraduate students in their last class that we would have in person, that really, in fact, what was happening with COVID was the capstone experience of their degree, if not their lives. And I tried to impress upon them that this couldn't be a better capstone test for them. That what were the things that we had been learning in our degree and that I had been researching to put into my book that would be necessary for an uncertain and turbulent world. And I think environmental studies scholars have long known that the number one skill that environmental studies students are going to get is going to be this ability to navigate a turbulent world. And that will require things like building relationships, having things like social capital and community trust. That relationships and communication are central to those projects and not just the skills of science or technology as techno-optimists might have in solving our environmental problems. And so we had read things like Rebecca Solnit's A Paradise Built in Hell, where Solnit writes about how in times of disaster, such as Hurricane Katrina, people have the sort of best in humanity can come out in those situations. And she tries to document how these micro utopias can emerge where people build the worlds that they want, even if just for a short time, in the sort of chaos that's happening. And so I told my students, this is your opportunity. All that's solid is floating into air. It's time for you to have a micro utopia and to rise to the occasion. And this is really the character of an environmental studies student that's going to be needed in the future. And I had just, I just published this book. I had just had this conversation with my students. I had no idea how the next 2.5 years would unfold. Are we almost on 3 here? I can't even do the math. 2 years, almost on 2 years. And this was also right about a year after the youth climate movement kicked off around the world. So the story of coming to awareness about how the psychological impacts of an uncertain world, much of which is about climate change. In fact, many of the scientists who I most respect have been making the connection between things like infectious diseases and climate change for some time. If you read the IPCC reports, you'll see that climate change has been predicted for a long time to increase infectious diseases. And so the kickoff of COVID and the prescient moment a year before of youth climate activism are all interconnected, of course, as is the movement for Black lives. So these kind of tumultuous times when everything is being rebuilt by this next generation, which happens to be the largest generation that the US has ever seen, is really the moment I was writing for and writing it. And so it has been quite an adventure since then. And of course, climate anxiety, especially when you count things like COVID, climate anxiety has only really been on the rise since 2020. And we, of course, had several rounds of fires in California and in Florida. I imagine that young people in your school systems are thinking about things like sea level rise and other things. Okay, so I will, that's my background in thinking about that. I will share, I do have some slides I'll begin to share here and begin the formal part of my talk. hang on for a second, let me share screen. Okay, that visible, Dr. Beaver? Yeah, okay.
That looks
Loading,
great.
loading, okay. Okay, okay, so just an opening slide. So if you don't already believe that climate anxiety and eco grief is another concept that we can talk about the differences between these concepts, but if you don't already believe that it's pervasive, I do have this sort of slide to say, look at all these places in popular culture and in research that the concept of climate anxiety is really emerging. It really became, it came onto the mainstream of thinking about mental health. The field of mental health started to think about climate change in about 2015, 2016, mostly because scientists who were studying climate change were starting to experience a lot of anxiety and grief around what they were observing. So those sort of front lines of people who are considered to have first identified this idea are the psychologists who were working with the frontline scientists and people who were, documenting the sixth extinction. And then it became almost into the realm of clinical psychology in Leslie Davenport's wonderful work, Emotional Resilience in the Era of Climate Change, where she calls on the field of mental health practitioners to take climate change really seriously and has practices for it. Even philosopher Glenn Albrecht, in his work, this is one of his most recent book, Earth Emotions, talks about how it is that the lack of vocabulary, at least in English, for the kinds of emotions that account for human relationships with the natural world is part of the problem, part of the reason why we have environmental problems to begin with. And so he calls for a whole new taxonomy of language around the human relationship to the natural world and feelings. Some of you may be familiar with the 2000, I believe it was 15, I have to check that, suicide of David Buckell, who was a New York human rights lawyer who immolated himself with gasoline, and in his suicide note left the message that this was symbolic of what humanity was doing to itself, and that he wanted to make the case and compel people to care about things through his own self-immolation. And I think that was the first big moment where people were saying, this is happening in a kind of even among the wealthy, right? Here we have this South Pacific Islanders who are resisting the inevitability narrative of climate change. Sea level rises or 1.5 degrees is kind of language that we hear a lot in the most recent COP conference in Scotland. And I think that this evokes a sense of, don't just write people off with the narrative of climate change being inevitable and being an apocalyptic thing. People are in fact trying to resist it, and long traditions of resilience and psychological and social movement practices are helping people do this everywhere. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Chris Jordan, the filmmaker who documented the albatross on Midway Atoll that had all of the plastic in their stomachs, the dead albatross. And he went through also a very serious depression after documenting that work. Other popular culture references to climate change and climate anxiety that you might be familiar with. I don't know if Big Little Lies is in your repertoire, but here we have Laura Dern's daughter, who was 8 years old, starting to have fainting attacks due to climate anxiety because she was being taught about what was happening with the polar bears in her very wealthy school in Monterey. And then I mentioned to Dr. Beaver and Dr. Kugler in the earlier moment before we came on about a recent study that came out in September 2021 by a large group of folks who are mostly out of University of Bath with Caroline Hickman, led by Caroline Hickman, about how youth climate anxiety is linked to government inaction. And this research studied over 10,000 young people ages 16 to 25 from 8 different countries around the world around their emotions around climate change. And so this is starting to become a very prominent discussion in many different circles across different geographic regions, across class, across race, across a lot of different demographic aspects. This conversation and how it plays out is kind of everywhere, lots of different disciplines and fields. I want to focus a little bit on this Lancet report that I just mentioned to hone in a little bit on the role of climate anxiety and climate emotions in young people, and how there is something to be said about this being a generational phenomenon. Although I've had a lot of people from many generations say to me, I'm a millennial, I'm a boomer, I'm an Xer. These matter to me too. And I fully appreciate that, but it's stunning how large this generation is and what this generation is likely to experience. They're going to experience probably the most economic upheaval of any generation. They're the first generation that will be less well off than their parents in America. They're also the most ethnically diverse generation that America has ever seen. They have the most student debt and other forms of debt than any generation. So there's aspects of this generation that are worthy of closer consideration. And of course, the Lancet report, which was global, not just the US, found that nearly 60% of the 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds from 8 countries surveyed in spring of 2021 over a 1-month period said that they felt worried or extremely worried about climate change. More than 45% of those questioned said that feelings about the climate affected their daily lives, and 3/4 of them said that they thought the future was frightening. Over half say they think humanity is doomed. And I want to just throw in there another data. About 1 in 4 do not want to have children because of the world that their children would inherit in climate change. They think the world is too unstable to have children in, which I think is a very different argument than we've ever seen around the tension between population and environmental causes in historical environmental movements in the US anyway. So pretty stunning data coming out of that survey. The Pew Research Center also produced this graphic, which I think is pretty helpful in understanding that this is really feels to be a generational thing. You can see that on the far right is the younger generation of 18 to 29-year-olds in these countries on the top. Don't ask me about Greece and South Korea. That's a different research question. But there it's reverse, which is interesting. I find that fascinating. But in most of these countries up top, you see this generational spread of concern around climate change. And again, the future being frightening from the Lancet Avaz report really brings to light the stunning generational difference of how people are perceiving climate problems. I got to become familiar with this because of my own students and how they felt, bringing their emotional responses to climate change, which I personally was not taking that seriously, I have to be honest. About 2014-15, I was far more concerned with my students' inability to complete their classes and their therapeutic reliance on me to help them through all of the heaviness of the things they were learning in classes than I actually was about climate change itself. So I was burning out, frankly, and I was trying to figure out how to help my students get through so they weren't so demanding of me. I didn't really particularly care about what they were worried about. So they brought this to my attention, as do all good students, and all the point of those of us who are instructors love teaching for this reason. Our students are constantly our teachers. So what were my students presenting with, and what was I not able to deal with? They felt that there was no good that they could do for the planet, only impact. And this was exacerbated by not just the dominant narratives of how environmental discussions are had. I even noted Dr. Beaver said something about human impact on and in the environment. And I thought, oh, there we go, and human impact. Right? There's this understanding that there's a sort of one directional thing, humans impacting to the environment, and that impact always being bad. So there's this narrative out there that I try to push against in my classes, and some of that, the cure that we need is a little pushing back on that narrative. The ecological footprint exercise is a classic exercise that you can find online. Just Google it and do it yourself. It tries to measure your carbon footprint based on your lifestyle and transportation choices. And of course, it was exposed a few years ago that BP created the ecological footprint exercise to try to deflect attention away from the fossil fuel industry and onto individual lifestyle choices as the main cause of our environmental problems. And so the individualization of environmental crisis is part of the story. We're trying to push it back. And so I'm just going to sort of pull back for a moment and get meta for a bit. I was also thinking, what do the environmental humanities have to offer this conversation about climate change and climate crisis? Because the humanities are often sidelined in favor of the sciences and the STEM fields to solve the world's biggest environmental problems. Sometimes economics, sometimes sociology, sometimes politics, but mostly STEM. And so humanities folks like myself have always been trying to get our elbow into the table, get our way into the door and say, you need us too, right? Ethics folks understand this. I noticed that in Dr. Kuehler's comment about how the necessity of ethics is everywhere, as is attested to by all these funders, right? Sort of this imperative, this tick we have of defending what we're doing all the time. And so one of the things that I often have been thinking is there's just some just straight up critical thinking skills that could really address climate change. And so that's the result. The result of that is the book, right? Because these critical thinking skills that are really unique to the environmental humanities are what I'm trying to bring to the table. Because I wasn't going to become a therapist or a psychologist or develop a whole new set of skills after I've already done my PhD. I wanted to know what did I already have that my students, that I could teach better and translate better for my students so that they could handle the crises that were unfolding around them and into their future. And one of those forms of critical thinking is thinking about where the ecological footprint exercise even comes from and whose interests did it serve and what was it deflecting our attention away from. This notion that all of humanity sucks, I notice this in my students often. They think that the peak of enlightenment is this realization that humanity is terrible. And in fact, much of humanity has not actually done terrible things to the environment. It's a very small percentage of humanity who's made the most egregious decisions that have affected things the most. And in fact, similarly, there are many cultures where, a more sustainable approach to human nature relations exists. And some people have argued, especially I'm thinking about the areas that I've lived in Alaska, Oregon, California, where indigenous ways of operating in the landscape, including things like prescribed cultural burning and that sort of thing, have actually enhanced biological diversity. And you look at the data on this, something like 80% of biodiversity is on indigenous land. And one could argue that that's because there are some people who don't suck, right? The problems are too big and interconnected, and people are too small and powerless to fix them. In my book, I call this the apathy trap. I think it's a pretty common phenomenon. And again, just a small dose of critical thinking can inoculate against this problem. If we think of the problem as so big, who's telling us that story of how big it is? How are we consuming the narrative that the problem is so big that we can't handle it? Whose interest is served by making it so big that we can't handle it? It creates what psychologists have shown is called the pseudo-inefficacy effect, which means that we feel that we're too small and the problem is too big. And if we think the problem is too big, we're not even likely to try to solve one small part of it. They use something called the child in the pond scenario to do this, and I'd encourage you to look it up. But I thought, aha, this is what my students are experiencing, the pseudo-inefficacy effect, and it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their problems that they fear happening will actually happen because they're told that it's inevitable and that the problem is so big. Also, we can change the way we think about how powerless we are. Powerlessness is also an illusion that capitalism wants us to have because it benefits people. For us, it benefits those in power for everybody else in the public and grassroots folks and students, young people to feel like they have no power. And so this is something we can spend a lot of time challenging. We're past the point of no return. There's this sort of phenomenon in climate discourse called doomism, and there's this battle between the optimists and the doomists out there, and you see them raging over Twitter. And, I'm sort of a both and kind of a person, so I'm not on anybody's side here, but I would like to point out that doomism is a self-fulfilling prophecy in part because of what we just mentioned about the pseudo-inefficacy effect, but it also has this result of making people not even try to prevent that future. And so there's a psychological reason, regardless of reality, that we simply have to deflect the doomism. Kari Norgaard is an environmental sociologist who discovered that it's easier for most Americans to imagine apocalypse than a post-fossil fuel society. And I think that the lack of the radical imagination is another way that humanities folks intervene importantly. We spend a lot of time talking about speculative fiction and the role of the imagination in making reality happen. And so this was stunning to me when I realized that most people can imagine the apocalypse. I then looked at psychology and sort of media studies folks like Steven Pinker, who's talking about concepts like the availability heuristic. And the availability heuristic is a concept that people are more likely to imagine something happening if they have easy retrieval to the image of it. So this is why popular culture and Hollywood and advertisements and the dominant narrative is very, very powerful. It's not that we can go around and choose to disagree with those things. We are psychologically inclined to believe the most recent thing that we've seen or the most dominant image that we've seen. And this, again, creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's no small matter that we can't imagine what we would desire instead of apocalypse. My students feel like their life course is unclear and it won't be like previous generations. And I imagine I explained to you economically what that would look like. And also in terms of reproductive refusal, which is becoming a very big topic in my circles around what's going, who is it that doesn't want to bring children to the world? Why is it different than previous efforts of population reduction? And of course, the reproductive justice dimensions to that. So that has to do with, young people thinking that in their lifetime of their children, the planet will not be inhabitable. That is quite an existential commentary on our moment. And this concept of eco-nihilism came to me because I had these students who could barely show up to class, and how are they going to go and save the world like we kept telling them they had to if they can't even get to class? This was really the moment of when I realized I needed to teach emotional skills, because they weren't going to say, no matter how many technological, scientific, political, economic skills they possibly had, they weren't going to deploy them in service of the climate if they didn't actually engage. And genuinely speaking, I am actually quite concerned, not at all in a facetious way, about the viability of my students' lives. I mean, I don't know about you all, but suicide is on the rise in my student body. And then, of course, we see this happening in the study that just came out, other elements of like anger and betrayal and resentment about previous generations. And that I'm hearing much more as I talk to young people. So this is kind of how my students have felt. And this will give you my watershed moment is when my students handed me this Valentine. They thought we were being fun. Now I appreciate it was funny and haha, we were all laughing and jocular about it all. And they made this Valentine for me. But I really did have to think about what was I doing in my class? This is what was going on with my students. So yeah, I don't think that we're living a macabre world over here at Poly Humboldt. It was done in a loving way. So I started to think about, I really needed to see my students process through all of these emotions as akin to something like the stages of grief, or maybe Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Other beautiful examples of kind of emotional journey are Goliath's Aldua's Nepantla, which I think is a really effective one for what students go through. It's a pretty common phenomenon that in college students go through kind of a Bildungsroman or a coming of age experience where their worldview is shattered and they have to build themselves back up again. I think that's a pretty common thing, and climate change just adds another level to it. I'm not suggesting that in that sense, there's something unique happening with my students. But in terms of climate justice issues and climate change, I wanted to tease out what was unique about that and ask the question, what was the emotional state? What was the emotional skill set or toolkit that young people were going to need to face what was going to be happening? Because it wasn't going to be all this other skill set. It wasn't even going to be just the humanities, it was going to be something existential, whether that's like spiritual, emotional, whatever it is you want to call it. I really felt ill-equipped to teach my students what it seemed like they were going to be needing. Somebody just muted me, sorry about that, I'm back. I created this journey, this kind of linear journey, which of course is not linear, where I just sort of mapped out what seemed to be happening to the majority of my students as they progressed through the curriculum of environmental studies. And I'll never forget one of my students saying that she was checking out, she was done with all this stuff, all she wanted to do is bake cookies, she's just baking cookies and bringing the cookies to class. And it opened up a door for me thinking about the role of pleasure and self-care and the role of food, the role of community making as actually a really essential scaling in that I think maybe some of us might have experienced a little bit of that in COVID. And I'll get to that a little bit more later, but it did have me seek out the role of joy, the role of delight, the role of pleasure in activist movements over history. And that's been that's a really important part of my book and what I'm trying to argue. And I define resilience as the end point, but of course, this is like this, right? I mean, we're all over the map on all these things, and there is some really good arguments for why resilience is not a great endpoint, and I fully appreciate that. What I define resilience is as feeling like you have some control over your environment in a collective. in a sense of collective. So efficacy plus collective is resilience. And I think part of the individualism that is so steeped in many of us as Americans, at least I was raised that way, is really part of the problem. And that's one of the places that we feel all that inefficacy. We feel all of that lack of power over our conditions. And that leads to depression and anxiety and not being able to engage. So this was just my attempt to try to create some sense of what their journeys were. And then I began to research the relationship between climate change and mental health, and was stunned to find out that all of these effects of climate change on people's mental health, is the studies that are documenting this are just exploding by the day. And so I just added another thing onto this from research I just did today, but extreme weather events creates trauma and displacement. Air pollution is linked to psychiatric illness and increased physical and mental health problems. Of course, we probably are familiar with increased heat leading to increase in interpersonal conflict and suicide. Environmental traumas such as having sea level rise displace you. Loss of livelihood and subsistence. In this sense, the very powerful climate philosopher Kyle Powys White talks about how climate change started in 1492 for indigenous peoples in the Americas. So let's not talk about it as an urgent thing that's just happening right now. Loss of livelihood and subsistence is a form of climate change that has not just physical, but mental health impacts. I'm thinking here also about access to good brain gut foods. So the element of food justice takes on a whole new urgency with climate change. Loss of kinship relations within the environment due to this ongoing pattern of climate change is just another layer on top of colonialism and extraction, slave relations. And so, one could say that the cause of climate change is actually rooted in these broken relationships. A sense of betrayal and moral injury by the government. And of course, worry about the future. What's not talked about in the discussions of climate change's effects on mental health is the vice versa element as much. Not many people talk about how important mental health is in order to combat climate change and to engage in climate change. And that's kind of where I want to turn my attention with my work and my students, is what are the mental health things that we need in order to engage in climate. One of the things that we can't be having is, and this is where my research into psychology has really helped me as I study this book, this notion that people operate the best and the most wisely in their long-term interests and the long-term interests of society, and are not selfish about it when they are operating what psychologists call the range of resilience, or the window of tolerance, as Dan Siegel calls it. And that when we're outside of the range of resilience, we tend to be more reactive. We have increased heart rates, all these bodily functions is triggering the amygdala and making people feel like fight or flight or freeze. Or we can be in hypoarousal where we're more numb to everything. So that kind of accounts for a lot of emotional responses to the climate problem. I know a lot of people who are in both those categories. In fact, I am sometimes often in both of those other categories and not in my window of tolerance to act in the best interest of climate justice. And so we simply, the climate requires that we are operating in that green zone as much as we can. Similarly, our bodies, as we know, the effects of stress on the body, chronic stress on the body, whether that's climate anxiety or any kind of anxiety, is that we sort of break down all of our functions. The greatest resource we have to combat the climate is our physical and mental health. And if we don't have that, then the powers that be are doing their very best to diminish the best solutions to climate change. And so when I started to realize how important our physical bodies were, our mental health, all of the resilience and resources that we have by just getting, for example, a good night's sleep and not feeling like jumping off a cliff, that the climate really needed that. And so I started to make the argument to my students, it's not a badge of honor to burn out. It's not a sign that you are committed to the climate cause that you don't sleep. These things are actually undermining your ability to do the work you want to do. And that's where the current conversation has really turned for me and my students and the people I'm trying to talk to and convince to take care of themselves. This is a chart that I really love, and I'll also translate it, but it gets to this point of, it's not just that climate change affects mental health, it's that our mental health also is necessary to address climate change. And if climate change is only impacting our physical and mental health negatively, we will no longer, which is on the left here in the red, we will be less able to deal with climate disruption, and therefore climate disruption will actually increase. So that's what that cycle on the left is, sort of the yellow triangle increasing when we're not able to deal with it. And on the right, you have a more ideal model, where we intervene on mental health and say, actually, we need our mental health in order to decrease structural stress and improve climate mitigation and thereby diminish climate disruption. And so I think this chart just gets to what I'm talking about in a different way. Or if you prefer a narrative of a young person saying it in her own words, this was a beautiful essay that came out in Yes Magazine by a 22-year-old Morgan Florsheim. She says it in a different way, but same concept about trying to get to this kind of mutual relationship between climate change and mental health. We need our mental health in order to combat the work that, the things that we want to combat. Depression tells us that we are once powerless and culpable, and therefore the only logical response is to disengage, turn inward, eschew connection, a response which only serves to reinforce the oppressive systems like racial injustice and capitalism that are responsible for our suffering in the first place. And this is exactly the kind of argument that makes mental health not just be about a pathology or an individualized thing. This is where mental health enters the realm of the political. And this is something that I think is beautiful about a quote that Glenn Albrecht writes, where he basically says, an increased vocabulary about emotions, about the environment is not about going more to your therapist or drinking more red wine or numbing yourself away from negative feelings or uncomfortable, unpleasant feelings. It's actually the entry point to making structural change that people need. And so this is where people like Jennifer Uchendu, who's a Nigerian youth activist, says, I want more people to feel climate anxiety. I want us to embrace climate anxiety as a positive thing. So what happens when we start looking at these so-called negative emotions in this other framework that's really kind of anti-American, right? We think of pursuit of happiness being so, essential. And if we're not happy, there's something wrong with us, something shameful. And another point I really want to make is that climate anxiety can affect our ability to address climate change in other ways too, that very much relate to questions of social justice. And so one of the ways that climate anxiety affects our ability to address climate change is that we live in stories like the doom story or the imagination story or whatever, if we live in the story of doomism, because 85% of media that covers climate change covers it in the negative frame. If we live in that story, it will determine our actions. And this is just a classic insight from people who studied the humanities, and people have actually proven this in psychology too. So it's not just humanists reading literature, can tell you that. Some key psychological terms here, and I've mentioned a few of them, is the availability heuristic, negativity bias, and the pseudo-inefficacy effect. And I mentioned the first one and the third one. The negativity bias is particularly powerful here in that humans, because of the reptilian brain, the parts of the brain, again, I had to learn this stuff, try to study this, focuses much more on negativity than on positive things that happen to us. And that means that there might be equal amounts of positive things happening to us as negative things, but we're more likely to perceive that the world is very negative than it actually is. This is a very important survival strategy. This is a good thing in general, but it has this effect of making us think that we're living in a really doom and gloomy world, when in fact, many, many other great things are also happening. And so for my favorite psychological question I ask myself when I'm feeling my negativity bias kicking in is, what else is true? And then I go to all this other stuff that's also true, but I have to train my brain to do it. We have to train our brain away from that reptilian instinct. And of course, the media, because it wants our eyeballs and our dollars and the sponsorships, feeds that and fuels that, right? So the media looks like our negativity bias. And so it makes us think that we're living in a world. If media is portraying an accurate portrayal of the reality in the news, then we're living in a pretty terrible place. And that can have the effect of changing the way we act. And of course, there's this element of eco-fascism and fear and how it is that a sense of urgency and being outside of our resilient zone. If we're hyper aroused all the time in our fight, flight, or freeze, we're not likely to act in the most pro-social way. And this has actually been something that my first book was about. Long history of the environmental movement in the US has been very much about fomenting this fear about other people doing these bad things to the environment, which goes back to this point I made about population earlier too. And this has actually led to folks like, for example, the 2019 Christchurch and El Paso mass shootings, both of those shooters cited climate change as a reason for what they were doing. And so there is a real strong movement already happening very powerfully to pick up climate anxiety as a source of xenophobia, nativism, racism, to sort of foment the white supremacy movement too. And so one might have in their minds that white supremacy and climate change don't go together, but they actually very much do. And people aren't thinking about this as much. And I do spend some time in an article I wrote in Scientific American trying to really pick this apart, because after I wrote my book, I realized nobody was thinking about the kind of racial dimensions of climate anxiety. And I really wanted to bring that to the fore and warn us about it. So what are the emotional tools we need? I love this quote by Gus Betz. It kind of reiterates what I said earlier, but this is from a scientist, so it's not just me and my own humanities bias. I always felt like culture change was the domain I wanted to work in, and I wasn't going to work in as an engineer or a politician or anything. I wanted to work on, I like people. And here he is reaffirming to me that this is where it's at. I used to think that top global environmental problems, hang on for a second, were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought with 30 years of good science, they could address these problems, but I was wrong. The most environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Now, Gus Betz wrote about this before scientists actually did start to do this. We have a lot of scientists who are doing this. So I don't want to say scientists blanketly don't know how to do this, but there is something about the siloing of knowledge production that happens in different disciplines in academia that perpetuates this problem. So I wrote this book, and when this is my chapters, I kind of, like I said, I thought, okay, what do my students need, and how can an environmental humanist with the tools we have come up with some good stuff that would help students, help the next generation tackle this problem? One is embracing life in the Anthropocene. And so this is a notion of accepting that the reality of their lives is going to be turbulence. Getting schooled on the role of emotions in climate justice work. Here I draw on a long history of emotional intelligence in both psychology and social movement theory of the role of joy and delight and resilience and hope in a lot of different social movements. Cultivating climate wisdom is almost sort of like a embracing your death kind of spiritual experience, right? Once we realize that everything is impermanent and that our emotional lives dictate very much what we do and we act, we start to really take every single moment and every single emotion quite seriously and realize that they in fact dictate the world around us. Claiming your calling and scaling your action is my students' favorite chapter. And this one has to do with thinking about how it is that you figure out where your particular avenue into climate work is, because many students feel like this goes to the powerlessness feeling of my students. Hacking the story looks at the ways that the story that we live in very much dictates what kinds of work we will do and how we feel like getting up in the morning and engaging it. Being less right and more in relation is a chapter where I talk about how across both the sort of the red and the blue lines, but also within activist movements, there's a sort of justice versus old school climate movement debate happening too, and how it is that we can build these bridges and making a case for why relationships are far more important than our own righteousness about a cause. And if you don't like that idea, read the chapter first and then come back to me. Ditching guilt, moving beyond hope, and laughing more is where I get into all this research on these sort of more pleasant emotions and turning in the environmental climate movement more into a carrot and less into a stick. And that guilt is in fact a very unhelpful emotion for a lot of long-term activism, which is what we're going to need. Resisting burnout, that sort of speaks for itself, but I speak here to the unique thing that happens among activists around burnout, where burnout doesn't really apply to them because their cause is so urgent and they're so needed. So I try to tackle that particular tendency towards burnout. And my favorite concept, feed what you want to grow. This has to do with retraining the negativity bias away from all the things that we're afraid of and towards the things that we love. Because of course, fear and grief and anxiety are secondary emotions in response to the primary emotion of something that we love being threatened. And if every time we go down this rabbit hole of fear and anxiety and grief, we can pull out and try to retrain on what it is that we're loving, we tend to be able to pull out of that hole and focus back on something that's right immediately in front of us. And that gives us a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop to keep doing it. And so that's really the one that I think that's probably my favorite one right there. I can talk more about that. And I'm getting close to the end here. The way that I would translate the book for an audience that doesn't read the book is these sort of questions that I, right at about 6 months into COVID, felt myself going down a path. And I said, okay, it's a good thing I wrote this book on psychological resilience, because I think I need some of those skills right now. And so I put some of these questions on my fridge. And so these are my fridge COVID questions that have come out of the book for you. Are you personally resourced? If your resource and your cup is full, you're able to weigh the pros and cons and react and act rationally in service of your values and missions. And I put these key terms in italics for those academic geeks out there who know some background about this or want to look up some more of this. I won't get into them here. Do you feel you have control over some conditions of our lives? I should have said you, not our. Sorry about that change in person. Investigate your grief and anxiety. It points to what you love and what you fear is under threat. Start there. Feed what you want to grow. Are you living in a story of resilience and progress, or are you living one of decline, unraveling, and apocalypse? And again, I'm thinking, I really draw on the work of Joanna Macy here, and in her work that reconnects, she talks about the stories of now and tries to help people who go through her work that reconnects live in, imagine a different story. I also love, for the same purpose as Paul Hawkins' book, The Blessed Unrest, in which he talks about the armies and underground sort of groundswell of people across the planet, these nameless people who are not part of the dominant news story, who are all doing this work on the climate. Are you aware that you're not acting alone and you're supported and surrounded by community? Are you visioning what you want? What kinds of collective structures of mutual support do you want that instead of what exists? And this is kind of my driving question about desiring the future. And I ask this of my students: what would it take to imagine thriving in a climate change world? This blows their mind. And the strategic question that really breaks open people's imagination and helps them think about immediate next elegant steps is, what would it take to desire rather than fear the future? And so there are my students at the People's Climate March back in 2015 or something. I can't remember what it was, but I just love that picture because that is their micro utopia right there, right? They're doing it, and that's how you start it. I'm going to wrap up and say thank you and open to questions, and end on some of my favorite quotes. Robin Wall Kimmerer: even a wounded world is feeding us, even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair. Not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. And Bayo Akamolafe's beautiful quote that I find myself saying all the time to myself to just calm down: these times are urgent, let us slow down. And so thank you so much. I'm going to end there and let Dr. Beaver take it from here.
Thanks, Dr. Ray. That was beautiful, and I'm grateful for leading us down that path. As I've been collecting questions across your comments, I've sort of seen two chunks, I guess, two types of questions. And I'm going to break these up in a kind of artificial way, but maybe it'll give us two piles to deal with. One, a lot of folks had questions about motivation to action. Like, how do we get to the point where we're dealing with an issue conceptually and how we move it to action? The first question, if Robin Roberts is still here, Robin, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I took it to be kind of a moral motivation issue.
Well, hi, thank you, Sarah. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good. All right. Well, I'm really thrilled to be a part of this. I'm an accounting professor at the University of Central Florida, and you might be surprised to know that there are accounting professors who care about all these issues that you're talking about. And, I think we could get together and find out. I'm on the executive council of the Social and Environmental Accounting Research Council. And so please know that there's business folks out there who care about what you're doing. But and that sort of leads to my question, which is, how can we use research on emotions to help convince rational economic thinkers that the collective action problem should affect what they do? We just are so focused on rational self-interest theories. So I'd like to get some more ammunition for them from you. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll turn mic off, but I might turn it back on. We'll see.
Cool. So thank you for that assurance that there are people in accounting who care about this. And of course, I know the environmental economists that I talk to care about it, and they want to use the very tools that seem to cause the problem in the first place to try to address them. And I'm a big Donella Meadows fan, and so I understand leverage points in the system, and systems theory in general, I think, is super helpful. So yes, and I'm fortunate to be at an institution where people in almost every department care about environmental issues. And so there's not a sense of, oh, over there in business, they don't care, fortunately they do. We have a sustainable business, master's degree that they offer. So I'm surrounded by some good people, and it's really reassuring to hear you say that too. Your question has to do with how do we bring the science of emotions to people who may be really attached to this binary between reason and emotion. And there is some very, very good research on this. You don't have to look at my book or even anybody who's doing climate emotions, although I think there are some great people doing that in particular, around how human beings in general, and they do huge studies of this, so you have statistical significance all you want for those folks, that our decision making and our behavior change is very much emotional. So you can look at people who study things like advertising and trying to get people to consume different things. Of course, I look down my nose at all that stuff, but they're using the science of emotions, of course, to get people to buy stuff, right? For example, if among decisions something is a default, if among decisions something, there's all kinds of emotional reasons we make decisions. I think nudge theory is probably one of the best. I don't know if that's what the book is called, but there's nudge behavior and nudge theory that brings on all this science of emotions and how we make decisions. And what all that stuff proves is that human beings in general make their decisions based on emotional reasons more than rational reasons, period. And so if we want to affect behavior, change leverage points in the system, we have to assume people are emotional beings, not rational beings. I mean, I could go on and on about it, but I mean, there's so much research out there that shows this, and this is contradiction to the Cartesian Enlightenment way that we think about the world, right? I mean, I can't tell, when I used to teach composition to students, I used to ask them, which kinds of arguments appeal to you the most? Is it pathos, ethos, or logos, right? Is it emotion, logic, or credibility, right? Because this is how you teach composition writing, right? Like, which kinds of arguments are you going to use to defend your thesis? And then my students always, 100% of them, freshmen, would say, logic. I'm a logical person. I want facts, and that's how decisions are made. And that's what proves that I'm a smart person. And we all make decisions on facts, and that's what makes us awesome. And when you show them this research about how even the attachment to facts is an emotional thing, and how we make decisions for emotional reasons, not reason. Never. Confirmation bias is a great example of that. I think that would be very helpful. And then there's, of course, the work on emotional intelligence that's out there that we simply cannot perform in any arena, whether that's climate activism or Wall Street, when we don't have emotional intelligence skills. And so those people who are doing emotional intelligence work out of, I believe it's Yale or wherever it is, have all that data, even though I like it to be used for good causes and not for more harmful causes. The research is out there, but it's a great question. And to me, I would never have even studied this stuff if it hadn't been all these arguments saying, yeah, these emotional skills are going to be way more important than all these other skills, because my students aren't even going to deploy any of those other talents if they can't get up in the morning, Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. I'm enjoying your talk so much.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
feedback.
Sure.
Thank you.
Dr. Ray, Robin's question made me think about your existential journey map that you laid out for us. And I was following along the steps, and I got to the move between nihilism to self-care. And I thought, that seems like a humongous step. Like, if you've fallen down that black hole of nihilism, you can't get up in the morning. How do you get from there to self-care? And I wonder if you could talk us through that, because like I could imagine through the sort of archetype of the hero's journey or something, I know that happens, but I can't picture how, especially in the context of climate change, when I said at the beginning that I feel that it's a dark problem, right? So I think I'm on the cusp of that nihilism fall.
Yeah.
So what does that move look like from nihilism to self-care?
Yeah, I think you
can't get up in the morning to baking cookies.
Yes, I mean, I'm not saying it's easy. But what I've observed in students, which is why I laid out that linear trajectory, is that when they go into that pit, I freak out. You know, I think I'm a failure. My student is unhappy. I've tortured them. They're going to check out of college, right? And this is actually, you know, happening around us. But in fact, the world is messed up, right? I can't remember the exact person who says this. You probably know it, Dr. Beaver, but right, like it's not a sign of mental health to be well adjusted to a not a terrible world, you know, right? There's some phrase like that. It's like perfectly reasonable response to the world to be kind of dysregulated all the time. So nihilism is kind of taking that to the extreme and finding no purpose for living, right? And there is something sort of powerful and beautiful in that place that is captured in the hero's journey, is captured in folks who talk about this from kind of more of a spiritual dimension, about how it is that you really have to get to the bottom of your grief to realize how precious everything is. And that, you know, you get to this facing mortality point and you think, well, I have a choice here. I can either embrace the preciousness of everything and just be grateful for every little thing and try to do my just do my best, you know, to make the world slightly better than the way I found it. Or the alternative is like despair forever, right? And I think some people, not all people, get to a point where they hit such a rock bottom that they choose to come out of it, right? They make a choice to say, you know, yeah, it's really, 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 really bad. But what choice do I have? I've got to like get up in the morning and engage, and I got to find something that keeps me doing that. And that's why I think that very, very small pivot, those micro changes in you know, nudge behavior theory come in, where you just look around what's immediately around you that gives you pleasure, because pleasure and pleasant emotions get you out of that more than guilt and more stick, because what drove you into it is a stick, right? The guilt, the worry, all of these emotions that the environmental movement trades in, right? The climate movement has long traded in emotions that most Americans find pretty repugnant. And so, you know, no wonder there's so much denial. You know, it's far more appealing than self-sacrifice, guilt. I have no positive impact on the planet. I'm terrible. I'm a virus on the planet. The world is going to hell. Humanity all sucks. I'm surrounded by idiots. I mean, that space is not a very, I don't know why the climate movement hasn't turned a corner on that yet. And I still see that in a lot of climate discourse that doesn't actually conjure up a lot of action out of people. Not long-term. You can get behavior change from guilt for like 3 to 6 weeks. That's what they found with the ecological footprint exercise. That kind of thing can do short-term behavioral change. But what we're looking for here is long-term, engaged, deep engagement for the long term, for people's lifetimes. And not just around lifestyle changes, around profound long-term structural change that they will never see in their lifetime. That's a different ask, you know. And so there's a sense, some people talk about, let's replace happiness with something more like eudaimonia, or something that's about a sense of purpose within a larger collective, which doesn't require happiness at all. You know, it might require some joy and delight, but it doesn't require this kind of superficial, you know, up all the time. In fact, one of the things I find so fascinating about my students is that when they dive into the problem and come through that nihilism, they're not happy. But man, they have a direction and sense of purpose. And there's a depth to it. And there is even something like, I don't want to call it happiness, but a sense of purpose to that work. And so I really think it's absolutely essential. The thing that always turns the corner for my students is sense of a collective. I'm not alone in this. There's all these people around me who feel the same way I do. I'm not crazy. The world is crazy. Let's go and fix it together. And we don't have to be happy while we do it. You know, because there's this fetishizing of happiness that is part of the problem too, you know.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Dr. Kubler had a question that I think is related to this gap that we were addressing. Steve, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Ray, I really enjoyed all the things you had to say. They're very provocative and got me thinking. And you just implied a connection between climate anxiety and climate deniers. And I wondered if you could unpack that some more. Is there empirical evidence that to support a suggestion that maybe climate anxiety or even the messaging and the way it's communicated is actually driving or exacerbating climate denial?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. The person who I would refer you to for empirical evidence would be more like someone like Renee Lertzman or Jennifer Ladino. So I can't speak to empirical evidence, but the psychology around the so-called negative emotions or uncomfortable emotions, at least in the cultural context of America, where we fetishize happiness so much and we pathologize negative emotions as something stigma pathological that you have to go deal with on your own in private, right? And we certainly reinforce that in classrooms, right? We expect students to come in and leave their hearts at the door and just bring in their brains. Even though pedagogy, all the best pedagogy theory out there shows that people learn better, retain information better, perform better on tests, and have better outcomes in their careers when they are engaged on an emotional level in the classroom. For example, trust is an emotional one of the biggest emotions that needs to be cultivated for the best conditions for learning. So yes, anxiety is an extremely unpleasant emotion and people would like to get rid of it. Same with guilt. They're more likely to just do whatever it takes to get rid of it, whether that's denial, addiction, more shopping, swiping, social media. I don't care what it is, right? But I don't blame them. I don't want to be there either. You know, I don't like that feeling. And so they're given, and I think Don't Look Up, the film does a really good job articulating this particular problem, even though I have other problems with that film, but this particular problem of no matter how much reality is telling you that this is a problem, there's no emotional way to deal with it, right? And so the best solution is denial. And so my suggestion there is that we ought to be, people who care about the climate ought to be much more empathetic or sympathetic maybe to people who might be considered deniers, right? That the categorization of denier versus believer is way too black and white and too unnuanced, and in fact, very, very much undermines our efforts to get together and work on this stuff. And that the sources of denial are psychologically very interesting and can be changed very much if we're not having this fight about righteousness, right? The person who I like, whose work is the best on this, that I follow the most on this, is Catherine Hayhoe's work. Catherine Hayhoe is a climate astrophysicist, some science person who's also an evangelical and does a lot of work with evangelical communities. And her argument is, if you just drop dots between the things that concern people that they are afraid of with climate change, rather than fight people about it, you're constantly building those bridges, you can get there. And denial goes away quickly about that. I think denial is a very misleading concept. It doesn't help us. And that the sources of people not wanting to engage with climate change are more like apathy, powerlessness, the fact that we're given this problem, but like the film Don't Look Up, there's nobody telling us what to do about it. And so the easiest thing is to just carry on with the blinders on. So yeah, this has to do with that Kari Norgaard quote, you know, the more imagination we have about how to get out of it, the better, you know, we just don't have an imagination for it. That's
helpful, thank you.
Yeah, and the chapter on Be Less Right, More in Relation kind of dives much more into that if people are interested in more on that, yeah.
We've got questions from Donnie and then Yara. Donnie, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, hi. Hi, Dr. Ray. I'm curious about your opinion on like the relationship between, like corporations often try to pass the responsibility of climate change onto the consumer, thinking like offering more expensive biodegradable products, subscribing to composting services, that kind of thing. Like, what is your opinion on taking part in those, like as a consumer, if they don't have a very large impact?
Yeah, that's a great question, Donnie. So I mentioned that the BP created the ecological footprint exercise, right? To do that exact thing of passing on the response, deflecting responsibility away from corporate behavior onto individual behavior. And I think there's a couple of answers to that question, I think. One is that the climate movement, if you think back to something like An Inconvenient Truth, at the end of An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore just gave us a list of all these things we could do that participated in the economy, like getting cheap, better light bulbs, right? And people who cared about climate were really infuriated by that. But of course, what it did was it told people, okay, baby steps, nudge behavior, these are little things you can do around yourself. It doesn't involve completely overhauling capitalism by tomorrow, get on it. And the climate movement has sort of swung the other direction and sort of said it's all corporations. There's nothing in your individual lifestyle choices could possibly do to impact anything. That straw is not going to matter. And so now people are checked out, right? So it's kind of swung too far the other direction. There's something in the middle there. As Marianne East Heglar is one of my favorite thinkers on this. She talks about there's something in the middle. It's like systems theory, right? And there are ways to participate in a capitalist society that are better than others. And until we have something else to operate in, I would like the capitalist solutions rather than the capitalist problems. There are leverage points in the system that can be changed to reward and punish behavior better, much, much, much better. And so until we get rid of the system, I would like us to use those tools better. Okay, so on the one hand, yes, let's have some better green capitalism. On the other hand, the argument has been made that capitalism is the source of the problem. Some people would say colonialism, slavery are actually, broken human relations are in fact the source of the problem. This debate rages in the climate movement. Regardless, your question comes to if we narrow our sense of our empowerment to this one category of our consumer identity, we are really emaciated in our notion of how social change happens. And I really value that insight. Donnie, I think that's kind of what you're suggesting, right? Like our power doesn't just reside in where we spend or don't spend our dollars. Our power resides in all kinds of other spaces. And I think that's one of the ways that in my chapter on scaling your action and finding a calling has to do with really broadening people's notion of what it means to make an impact, a positive impact. All the spheres of influence that we have all the time, just walking around and on the earth. Every single day we wake up and every single thing we do can have an impact, positive or negative. And if what we do is try to dial back the harm in all kinds of places, not just where we spend money, but in all the things that we're doing, building community becomes a priceless thing, dollar for dollar. And this goes back to the first question, right? Dollar for dollar, money spent on building community trust, social capital within a community, spaces where communities can get together. I mean, this is sort of Robert Putnam's argument, bowling alone, right? He's talking about where we have a sense of civic connection. We are actually more likely to be able to bounce back from a natural disaster than anything spent on disaster response or even preparedness infrastructure. So the better your bridges are, matters less than how good your social fabric is. And that's something you can get to work on right now. It has nothing to do with your dollar, how you're spending your dollars or solar panels. And people talking about green technology, all this stuff that's all about innovation in economics and innovation and thinking about new technologies or sustainable this and that. That's all awesome. I mean, like I said earlier, I'd rather that than the alternative. Let's go, let's do that stuff. If that's what gets everybody pumped up. But let's not forget how much other power there is among people who are not doing that work. They're doing something else. They're building community or something, right? They're creating art, right? Cultivating the radical imagination. No social movement didn't ever have art, It's there's all kinds of intangibles that don't have, they can't go on a budget line,
Sure. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, such a good question.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. Yara, I saw your hand. If you want to go ahead, please.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ray. I really appreciate your presentation. As someone who works with students often, I often struggle with managing that optimism in ways that kind of fit within the red tape of a university while without steering them towards nihilism and that nothing they do matters. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I'm currently leading the university's development of the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan. And we've outlined some vision and goals around operations, of course, but we're also expanding around goals for academic, sustainability, curriculum integration, research integration, and our work in the communities. A lot of the learning outcomes are very much focused around hard skills. And my first question for you is, what are some examples of soft skills we should be ensuring our students leave with? And then my second question is, other than measuring sustainability literacy, what are some other indicators that we're making good progress towards community building?
Wow. That is really the million-dollar question. That is such a great set of questions. First of all, thank you for doing that work, because it's not easy. And that bridge from operations to academics is just, it's a hurdle everywhere. You know, everybody I talk to is like, how do we get this? How do we get these silos broken down? How do we get these units to work together? And we struggle very much with that question at my institution too. And I don't really have the best answer for how to do that. So, good, you know, I'm thinking a lot about it, but it's kind of like this uphill battle, right? We finally have institutional learning outcomes around sustainability and around equality and justice, and we make them linked, because there's so many people who are like, don't make those separate, you know, make them linked. So that feels like a huge achievement. We are now trying to get platinum rating in the STARS rating, which is probably, I don't know where you're at UCF, but this requires new levels of breaching into the academic stuff. And so I'm sure there are, you know, I'm sure you attend ASHE conferences, and there's probably really cutting edge research on sustainability in higher education that tells you how to do that. But the part of your question that I most want to kind of attract to is the question about what are the emotional outcomes you might build in there. And it is, you know, I do not want to suggest that this is just another story about the young generation not having enough grit or something. You know, that is not at all what I'm suggesting. But Michael Manier's 2014 or 15 piece called Teaching for Turbulence talks about this combination, this cocktail of despair plus urgency leaves students feeling really powerless and lacking motivation to act. And that's what started happening in my classes. I don't know if that's happening to you too. It sounds like it is. And so the antidote to despair and urgency is a sense of power, efficacy in a collective. And I think if you can do measures for efficacy in a collective, however you want to do that, it's better than nothing, right? A sense of efficacy in a collective would look very different in different disciplines, but those would be skills that could be translated across whatever people's career paths end up going for sustainability after their degrees. And they potentially could be even measured. You know, when you have to do the assessment of these things, it could potentially even be measured. You know, how much more do you feel like you can make a difference at this age, you know, this as you move through your program? Where, you know, do you know what your spheres of influence are? Yes or no, right? Like, you know, there's all kinds of strategies around this. I'm thinking right now about there being actual tools and measuring tools out of UC Irvine's Community Resilience Institute or program. They have a Community Resilience Institute that's run by a person who I just admire, who's shaped by thinking immensely, named Abigail Reyes. And she really breaks down, what her point is to break down the walls between the institution and the community. And so she has all of these community resilience metrics that she measures. And I would suggest reaching out to her. She's really dialed this in. She's my go-to resource on this question. But in my own classroom, what I do is I measure their sense of community with each other. The lab, you know, Bell Hooks writes that the classroom is a lab. And in this climate anxiety moment, to me, that means if they're going to prioritize relationality over righteousness, which was a radical moment of change for me. I thought I was just arming my students to be more right about environmental justice problems. But it turns out that wasn't getting them anywhere. That was part of the problem. And so relationship building ends up being more important. So can we do, like, what kind of, communication skills do they have? Do they know how to have a nonviolent communication conversation? Where are their difficult dialogue skills? How are they building community? What role does the imagination have in these different things? There's all kinds of ways you can ask those questions and get to what I would consider humanistic metrics, And like I said, I was looking for this golden answer. What's the emotional outcome that we need to build into our syllabus instead of all this other stuff I have, And I came to something like efficacy in a collective, but I don't know if there's lots of ways you can get at that, I think, But the strategy in classrooms is there's a lot of strategies, but one of the big ones is to include just as much solutions as you provide problems. And so the vast majority of environmental educators think that we were trained, just barrage everybody with the problems because they're not awake enough, they're not aware of it enough. Let's just keep fire hosing the problems at them. This case study and that case study and that case study, and look how terrible things really are. Now you're educated. Go off and fix them. And that was definitely the way I was taught to teach. I mean, that was what I assumed I was supposed to do with students. But the backlash of that is evident. Students come into the classroom already knowing a lot of that. They know problems are bad, but they actually need something very different now. I mean, students need something different now than they did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And we need to update. We need to be updated around that. And so how to create solutions, how to model themselves after other people doing solutions, that has a huge psychological effect on their sense of efficacy. If they see all around them, that's why I love Yes Magazine. If they see all around them, people figuring out how at the small scale, again, this goes to that question of changing the scale of the problem. The problem isn't like it's not the problem. The perception of the problem as being too big it's just that, it's a perception. Climate change touches absolutely everything around us. And we only are small. We were never bigger than we are. And this is where Adrienne Maree Brown's work is so beautiful. Small is all. Small is good. Small is all. So the scale of climate change is what's right in front of you. And look at all these people doing it in their community, in their community, in their community. All those places are building resilience against climate change, So it's not big. It's right around the corner. It's right in front of you. That sense of there are solutions at my fingertips. Other people are doing it. I'm in a collective. I'm not alone. All that kind of thing. Yeah. How you build that in, though, I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are people in the Sustain ASHE community who are really asking this question, and I'm not the only one thinking about this. I think ASHE would be a great resource, and maybe we should have an ASHE conference on this topic because I feel like everybody's asking this question. So you're not alone asking that question. Thank you for that great question. I love that question.
Yeah, and thanks for your work at UCF too, Yara. I've been thinking about this a lot as I've been listening to the two of you talk back and forth. I was thinking about these approaches that we're trying to do in developing ethics cultures from the perspective of the Center for Ethics. Like, what does it look like to work top down versus bottom up, to sort of build individual efficacy and action, but also meet that with institutional transformation goals and metrics and outcomes, and have those two things meet in the middle. And it seems just so messy because what we want our students to do versus what our institutions are set up to do don't seem to jive, right? It's like two pieces of two different puzzles that we're trying to mash together. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to.
Yeah, that part of your question, Yara, was something I didn't speak to, and I really loved it too. Dr. Beaver is absolutely right. The institution is built against so much of this stuff. And I find this very weird and cognitive dissonance all the time when I'm teaching, because I feel like what I'm teaching my students is that they're going to need skills that the current economy doesn't reward yet. They're being trained for the world that is being born, not the old world. So why are we doing professional development for the old system? So there's all kinds of ways that's challenging. Yara, and I agree. I think there's somewhere in the teaching students about structural change being super slow and not yielding results that you want, and celebrating small triumphs, and being able to celebrate change even at this sort of stretched out scale, and doing the work even if you think it's never going to be something you see in your own time there or tenure or lifetime. those are skills that I think everybody needs for social movements. And I mean, we're all in institutions and that's all we got. Yeah.
Dr. I have sort of two more questions for you. The one is coming from me, and then I want to end with one from Professor Liz Grauhaus here. But the first question has me thinking about your Hacking the Story chapter, or maybe your Claim Your Calling chapter. And I wanted to know more about, from your perspective, what role does film and fiction play, especially for young people's thinking about hacking and claiming? I'm thinking here of, like, you know, all of the landscape that we live in right now, the Thanoses and the Wall-Es and the Elsas and all of these sort of like environmentally sub-themed or predominantly themed film and fiction pieces. Are these tools or are they distractions? Like, what's going on there?
That's a really good question. You know, I'm willing to stand corrected, but without getting into that film was good for the environment or that film was bad for the environment. I shouldn't go there, although I'm tempted. I'm like, oh, Wally, yeah. But I would say that they are an equivalent to greenwashing, which is, of course, putting making the environment the new shiny subplot that makes things exciting for people who like animals and birds and stuff, which is what turns out most children do, right? So it's kind of an easy way to grab attention. And I think that that's unfortunately probably is the net positive of perpetuating that environmental, pro-environmental ethic is probably not outweighed by the environmental damage that these films actually do. And that we have the availability heuristic problem there too, which suggests that young people will consume those stories about the environment and believe that those things are in fact how things work. And so many of those stories portray really black and white or narrow or uncomplicated views of sort of hero versus villain around the environment that are actually maybe more harmful than good. That's my cynic side of it. It is possible that that the environmental theme of that stuff is good and it perpetuates the environmental interests of the audiences. It's possible. But, you know, in general, Hollywood has done a terrible job at this stuff. And I'm actually consulting with some folks out of Hollywood to try to create climate emotionally aware kind of script playbook kind of stuff to help them do better around this. And it's fascinating how challenging that is. Climate change, as we know from folks like Rob Nixon and Amitav Ghosh and all kinds of folks, doesn't fit neatly into the narrative structures that exist for us. And so to capture climate change in an effective way that gets people to, you know, do and think differently, that doesn't oversimplify it, is challenging because climate change itself evades narrative in many ways. You know, to narratize it by inherently oversimplifies it. At the same time, I would like us to keep trying to do it, right? I think there was some great successes of things like Don't Look Up, even with its failures, right? There's so many interesting things that we got out of that film that really need to be achieved. But the dystopian model of much sci-fi and stuff like even Don't Look Up is overwhelmingly pretty damaging psychologically. So in general, dystopian stuff, I'm a little bit against, right? I mean, there's something you can get out of it, but overwhelmingly it just adds to this powerlessness feeling, this pseudo-inefficacy effect of not being able to challenge, not being able to take on the problem. It doesn't mean we need to be rose-tinted glasses and Pollyanna about things, but we need just as much evidence that there are ways to actually work our way out of the problem. Yeah, and cli-fi is a whole different element, a whole different thing. There is some really cool stuff there about Afrofuturism. You know, there's some, how do we envision the world we desire? How can we fictionalize the building of that world, the manifesting of that world? That stuff is super cool. That stuff is, I'm down with that. You know, at least it tempts students, it tempts people, readers, to think outside of what they think is possible. And like I've been saying, this is hugely important. Even Danella Meadows will tell you that's important. Even the
Idea of
economy.
coming like with new imaginaries, new space for possibility.
Yeah. I mean, that Cli-Fi, I think it's Matthew Schneider Meyerson, if you want to look up his work, actually tried to provide empirical evidence about whether or not Cli-Fi shaped people's environmental politics and action behavior. And in the world of literary studies, that attempt to measure whether a book can have empirical impact is considered not cool. But he did it anyway. And it's a very popular piece of research. And what he did find is that it sort of does. I mean, it's something like this, you know, it kind of is, kind of isn't. Not enough to get too excited about. But I still get excited about.
Well, I think you've kind of answered Dr. Greyhouse's question, but Liz, do you want to ask your question as a final word?
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, I'm a sociologist at UCF. So I'm all about the doom and gloom, right? I am decades older than your students, but I recognize I have the same beliefs and I tell myself the same stories. And your talk was just sort of the perfect thing for me at this time. So thank you. I guess my question is, at the end of the day, do you feel pretty optimistic about the future? Or maybe that depends on the day.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I suppose the response is a little bit cheating, which is that I sort of reject the question, right? I mean, it's like, if I say no, that must mean that all my attention is paid. I must assess the situation to look like we're on what Joanna Macy would call great unraveling, right? Where the great unraveling is true. And while she's telling me to think about the great turning, where everybody's a blessed unrest and it's going to be this great future, is just a lie, right? I am not optimistic, but that doesn't stop me from believing that optimism is essential for me to get up in the morning and do the work. So I just choose it. It is the affective ecosystem I have to cultivate for myself to live my life. And this is what I mean by cultivating climate wisdom in the second chapter of the book, where I do think, and Dr. Beaver's question about nihilism, I do think, and I have done this, you have to reach a really pessimistic place of thinking this is really bad, to come out the other side and say, regardless, I have to choose to live in a world where things have the potential of going okay. In fact, maybe even being good. Hang on for a second. What? I'm in the middle of something. I'm about to end. Can you guys see?
Can I have some of those fruit
This is
chips?
the thing I love most about Zoom.
She comes in and asks me if my mom talks all the time because she knows she has me. I'll say yes to anything. Just get away. Okay, they're having fruit strips. Okay. The older one was trying to keep the young one from doing that. The young one loves to do that. Sorry about that. So this idea of optimism, I really love thinking about optimism as sort of a strategic intervention, right? Like, it's not because I'm not basing my optimism on facts. I'm basing my optimism on an ecosystem of emotion that I have to live in. And I love, this is where Ellen Kelsey's new book, Hope Matters. It's an absolutely beautiful book. I strongly recommend it. She basically says there's nothing inevitable about this doom. The doom narrative is really damaging to people psychologically. It makes them it actually is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's all this evidence that suggests it could go okay. It could in fact be better. So I ask my students, what would it take to desire your future? So I wake up every morning and ask myself, what would it take to desire my future? Because I can't not desire my future. That is the definition of depression, right? And so, you know, I'm building the future I desire by feeding what I want to grow every single day. And I simply have to imagine that I'm reducing my harm on the planet, that I'm investing in something that's better in the future. And I have no guarantee that there's an arc bending towards justice, you know, as much as I love thinking that progress is inevitable. I know it's not. I mean, I'm studying enough history to know it's not inevitable, but neither is doom.
Thank you. You give me hope. It really is what I needed to hear. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I think we think that doomism is going to keep us disciplined and keep us vigilant. But in fact, it actually drains us of the resources that we need to engage the problems we care most about. And so it's not an option for me. Yeah.
Dr. Ray, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I'm grateful for your time. I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Kubler to close us out.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ray, for sharing your insights on the role of emotions in facing climate change. Thank you, Dr. Beaver, for moderating our event. And thank you, participants, for your very insightful questions.